witches, witch doctors, and other witchy entities. Today I've got stories featuring the evil versions of these folks who bring terror and dread, sometimes from beyond the grave. What would you do if you encountered a witch that wanted you dead when the curses you never believed in began to manifest? Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories about witches, and be sure to send me your scariest experiences at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. Also, check out Freaky Folklore, my other show, on Spotify, iTunes, or your favorite podcasting app. Now, let's begin. The Witch of Donner Farm. From HarshTruth. In the 1980s, when I was around 7 or 8 years old, my dad's dad died. He'd lost a long-fought battle against cancer. I hate to say it like this, but I remember my family feeling relieved. The stress and pain my grandfather suffered was finally over. Now, my grandfather had been a man who saved his money, but never came around to spending it. And as my grandmother had long since passed, my father received everything from his father's will. My family received over $60,000 in the will, and after some time planning and discussing with my mother, my dad decided to put it towards his dream home. He wanted to return to the country lifestyle he grew up in. He thought the fields and woods would be a better place to raise my older brother and I. Soon my parents purchased a beautiful ranch-style home with 80 acres of land, much of which still had to be financed, but the inheritance did cover most of it. I remember when I first walked through the doorway of my childhood home. It smelled of well-kept wood, the scent of freshly cut grass wafting in from the open front door. My mother left it up to my brother and I to decide between ourselves which rooms were ours. This would be my first time having a room to myself. I was so excited that I didn't care much which room my brother picked. I wish I would have cared, though. I ended up with the room furthest from my parents' room. This room was sizable, with 2 windows overlooking the fields outside. It also had a big closet that I had no idea what to do with. A lot of space for a boy who kept his clothes in a dresser. It was on the very first day we were there when the strange occurrences began. Having told our parents which rooms we decided on, we started to unpack separately in our rooms. I was sitting in the back corner of the closet of my room, figuring out how to stack my collection of board games, the only things I could think of to place in there at the time. I'd left my closet door open, as well as my bedroom door, so that lights from the house and from outside would shine into the closet. The closet did have its own light source, one of those light bulbs with a pull string, but I had a lot of trouble reaching it, so I didn't want to bother with it. I recall having just set down my Monopoly box when the closet door slammed shut. Instantly, I shot up and turned around. Without any light from the outside, the closet was pitch black, save for the narrow crack under the door. Uneasy, I called out my brother's name, assuming he was joking with me. There was no reply. I ran toward the door using the crack of light at the bottom as my guide. Then I scoured the dark for the doorknob. Relief filled me when I found it, until I tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. It didn't make sense. The closet door didn't have a lock on the inside or outside of it. Why wouldn't it turn? A scared child, I could only assume my older brother was on the other side holding the doorknob still. We liked to joke with each other as all brothers do, but he had never been one to prank me like this. He was as much scared of the dark as I was. Moments after realizing trying to open the door was futile, I turned back toward the center of the closet and reached my hand upward, looking for the string to the light, or rather feeling for it. It was difficult for me to reach, but I knew if I could just feel the tip, I could jump up and yank it down, and the darkness would disappear. The longer I stepped blindly through the dark, the faster my heart pounded. Being engulfed in darkness was a nightmare come true. Little did I know things would get worse. I did finally feel the small caplet at the end of the string. Before I could jump up and attempt to yank the cord down, I felt something that took my breath away. An icy cold hand. From behind me, it placed itself on my neck and slowly ran up my cheek. I jumped and screamed so loud some of the blood vessels in my face busted. I practically tackled the wall next to me to get around the thing that had touched me, because it had come from the direction of the door. Quickly, I scuttled toward the door and began to pound against it, screaming for anyone that might hear me. Moments later, my dad pulled the door open from the other side. I nearly fell on my face. I crawled out and immediately looked back into the closet. The darkness now cowered away from the light that flowed back through the open door. The closet, except for my board game stack in the back, was empty. My dad picked me up and embraced me and looked at my face. Buddy, did you lock yourself in there? Jeez, look at your face." He wiped tears away from my red cheeks. As he carried me to his and my mom's room to comfort me, I couldn't bring myself to tell him that the door didn't have a lock. But I did manage to tell both of them what happened in there. But they blamed it on my intense fear of the dark. Specifically, my mom said being that scared can make you see or feel things that aren't there. She compared it to seeing figures or faces in the dark, when what you're actually looking at is a coat rack or a chair. As much as I loved my parents, I did not agree with a word of what they said. The hand I'd felt so long ago there was vividly real, and I remember it clearly even now. That hand was not my own, nor was it my imagination. Later on, when Dad went to my closet one night to grab one of my board games, I watched him do a double take when he opened the door. It was the first time he'd actually taken a look at it. My dad looked the doorknob over on both sides and raised an eyebrow. "Hey, buddy," he said as he checked out the closet door. "If you go in here, make sure you don't close the door or you might get stuck in there again. There's no lock, so it's probably just warped or something." I nodded and did my best to believe him. Over the next few months, small but weird and creepy things would happen, particularly in that part of the house towards my room. Dirty clothes I'd lay in the bedroom floor would often wind up inside the closet floor the next morning. When I began closing the closet door every night out of fear of the darned thing, it would always be open in the morning. One day when I was out playing after having cleaned my room, my mom called me back inside, absolutely furious. When I went back inside to my room where my mom was, she was fuming because of how trashed my room had become. She thought I hadn't cleaned it, but the state it was suddenly in was worse than I'd ever seen it before. Every drawer in my dresser had been pulled out and dumped out. My blanket and sheet from my bed had been pulled off and tossed over the closet door, which was now open. And inside the closet were hundreds of board game pieces, as someone had dumped each of the boxes out onto the floor. I was flabbergasted, but no matter what I said to my mom, she wasn't having it. She demanded I clean my room properly before I was allowed to come out of the room. Obviously, I was upset, but I did as she said. I cleaned as fast as I could, folded all my clothes again, remade my bed, then stood at the opening to my closet. I couldn't bring myself to walk in there alone, especially after something or someone had just ruined my room, and I know it wasn't me or my brother, because we'd been outside, and why would my parents mess up my room? Deep down, I knew it was the thing in the closet. I stayed in that room 2 hours longer than I had to, unwilling to enter that closet to pick up the board game pieces. But when my stomach began to growl and the smell of homemade fried chicken filled the air, I forced myself up and into the closet. It took me a few tries, but I managed to jump up and catch the string to the light bulb. so at least I'd have some light if I did get stuck in there again. Quickly, I started to pick up the pieces on the floor. It was a pain matching them up with the right boxes, as about a dozen different games had been mixed up. Every few seconds, I glanced at the closet door, making sure it stayed open. I thought nothing would happen if that door was open. I thought nothing could happen if the light was on. I was wrong. I picked up the final piece eventually, a small white ball that I'm pretty sure belonged in the Hungry Hungry Hippos box. I threw it in, closed up the box, and turned around. I stopped. A woman stood in the doorway. Her feminine shape made me first think it was my mother, but she was taller than my mother. Her hair was a mess and went down to her ribs. She stood facing away from me in a stained but light blue dress. She appeared to be looking out the windows of my bedroom. My voice failed me. I wanted to speak to her, but I had no idea what to say. I wanted to think it was some long-lost relative coming for a visit that I'd never met before, and I hadn't known was coming. Denial is a powerful thing. The woman breathed in and out so slowly that I didn't hear her first breath until long after I studied her. Her breath was extremely slow and troubled, as if she'd been a smoker for multiple lifetimes. Then she lifted a bony finger and pointed towards one of the windows. I swear I heard her speak then. I think she said, "Such a nice day." Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, my vision was obstructed. I flinched away, first thinking that I'd suddenly gone blind, but as my hands felt up towards my face, I found greasy, messy hair covering my small form. Then, that slow, struggling breathing came from behind me. This woman was no longer in the doorway. She stood right behind me, with her hair draped over me. I screamed then, and I ran forward, where I last saw the open closet door. And Christ, this sounds crazy, but the few feet I ran to escape that closet, each inch of the way I floundered through that hair. Her breathing stayed in the same spot in the closet, but the hair seemed infinite, as if it no longer came from her head, and instead hung from the ceiling. Only when I burst out of the closet did the hair finally come to an end. I turned to shut the door and found once again the closet empty. These are a couple of my most terrifying experiences with what I would eventually refer to as the Witch of Donner Farm. Donner was the name of one of the previous owners of the land. I wish I could say I figured out who she was, that we moved, that it all stopped, but we didn't move, and it never did stop. It would happen randomly and things might calm down for months at a time, but she was always there, seemingly preferring my side of the house. The experiences only stopped after I moved out at the age of 20. If you want to hear more of these experiences, let me know. I'm sure most of you won't believe me. I wish I could sleep a bit better at night. The Witches in the Texas Woods, from SkippMcGrippIII. I live in the downtown area of a major Texas city. To get away from the city and enjoy the outdoors and some alone time, I would make the hour-and-a-half drive almost every weekend to a small cabin that my folks have in the woods. I've been hanging out at that cabin in those woods almost my entire life, so I felt pretty comfortable there. The area doesn't have many people living there and it's relatively safe. So one weekend I took some of my friends out there to fish and spend some time away from the city. While fishing on the bank of the river that runs near my folks' cabin, we pulled up some chairs, started a fire, drank a few beers, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. That's the good stuff right there. After sitting around for a few hours, I suggested we go hunting the next morning for breakfast. The guys weren't big fans of the idea of waking up early to crawl around in the woods looking for something to eat. They would have rather stayed up all night drinking and fishing, and wake up late the next day. "Let's just go hunting now," said one of them. Everyone else agreed and started getting rowdy. I stayed put in my chair and replied, No, it's too late. It's too dark. We wouldn't be able to see a thing out there, man. Plus, those dang witches." Everyone knew I made a good point, but then one of them said, "Whoa, wait, what do you mean witches? What are witches anyway, like really?" I laughed a bit because they all seemed so intrigued, and all of a sudden so focused. So I began telling the story of the last time I went camping and hunting in the woods around my parents' cabin. It was just like any other camping hunting trip I'd gone out on. I'd packed a backpack with all the necessities, a .22 long rifle, and an M&P 45 that I always carry. I parked my truck at my folks' and walked down the dirt road until it disappeared into the woods. I make a point to not overhunt in any one area, so I hiked in a direction I knew I'd never hunted in. After a few hours of hiking, I found a good clearing in the woods that would have allowed for a good amount of moonlight once it got dark. I don't use a tent when I camp alone, so setting up my camp was fairly easy. I got a fire going, and I hurried off to find some small game for dinner before it got too dark. After bagging a few squirrels and a rabbit, I started to head back to my campsite. The night had already started to settle in, so it was getting quite dark on me. I took a moment to light my lantern that was hanging off my backpack. I poured some lantern oil in it and lit it. A few hundred yards later, I heard movement in the distance. Obviously, while moving through the woods with a backpack with a rifle strapped to it, you make a lot of noise yourself. However, the noises that came from deeper in the trees have a distinct sound, like an echo or a reverberation. So when I heard movement coming from somewhere else other than myself, I froze, staying completely still and listening. There was nothing. My brain started reasoning as fast as it could, and concluded that a branch might have fallen, or a deer got spooked and hightailed it out of the area. That was good enough for me. So I continued on through the dark in the direction I knew my campsite was. Compasses don't lie, and I'd learned how to use them and rely on them by this point in my life. I heard it again though, noises coming from my right, north of where I was. And this time I almost thought I heard a yell of some kind. Again I froze, thinking, coyotes. I'm not too worried about coyotes, so I continued. The way back was starting to feel really long, though. But hiking through the woods during the day is very different than hiking through the woods at night. You usually hike slower, watching your steps more carefully, so it's not unusual that a hike the same distance could take longer at night than during the day. Before I go on, I feel like I should say that I was recently married at the time, probably less than a year at that point. Like I wrote before, I traveled a lot throughout my life, and homesickness was not something I was familiar with until I met my wife. I'll call her Juliet here. We met when we were both 18, and up until then I had never missed my home or anyone really whenever I was away. But once we started dating, I began to finally experience the feeling of being homesick whenever I was away for too long, and in some cases, not long at all. That Friday evening, I left for the woods. I got home from work and sat down with Juliet for dinner before leaving. It had only been a few hours since I last saw Juliet, and yet I missed her so badly in those woods. So much so that I think I almost felt pain. Having said that, I think it'll make what happened next a little more creepy. Anyway, I'd heard something. I froze and I stood still in the dark woods and turned to my right. I was deeply confused because I knew what I just heard. It was Juliet calling me. Although it sounded like she was a bit far, There was no doubt it was Juliet. What's she doing out here? There must be some emergency. I gotta find her. She's probably been calling my phone, and it's not even on. Something bad must have happened, I thought, as my mind raced to rationalize and come up with a realistic conclusion. Chip! 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 She yelled through the trees in the distance. My name isn't Chip, but it's what Juliet calls me, and only Juliet. I basically jogged through the dark forest towards where I last heard her, stopping every now and then to listen for her again. Eventually I had to stop because I had not heard Juliet yell for a while. I stood there quietly panicking for what must have been 5 minutes, but every second was torturous. I felt like I failed to find my wife, to help her. She came all the way out here to find me because she needed me and I couldn't even find my way to her. And then I heard her again. Chip! 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 Her voice quietly resonated through the tall trees, and she sounded like she was in pain. I began to walk as quietly as I could towards her, so I could hear her if she called out to me again, and she did. She sounded noticeably closer. I was relieved as I felt myself getting closer and closer to Juliet. Chip! 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 This time I felt alarmed. I felt like I was about to be in danger, but I shook it off and continued toward my wife. Chip, Chip, Chip. Again I heard her calling me, but she didn't sound quite right. It was as if she was in pain, but also like it wasn't her at all. Just like two different people can say the same things in the same pitch and rhythm, but they can never sound exactly like each other. Like there was someone else pretending to be Juliet and mimicking her voice. But I had heard her so clearly just a few moments ago. I figured she was choking up, trying not to cry, so I kept moving. Again and again I heard Juliet calling me as I walked closer and closer. Each time she called, though, her voice sounded less and less like her. By the time she sounded like she was only 10 or so yards away, I was on high alert. It sounded nothing like her by then. Whoever it was calling me, she wanted me to believe she was Juliet, and by then I knew for sure it wasn't her. I approached carefully with my handgun drawn. This person wasn't moving one bit, but I could tell where she was. I walked closer, inch by inch, holding my lantern up in front of me, trying to see who I was dealing with. Then, peeking from around a tree, I saw two eyes reflecting the flame from my lamp. I have to admit, at that moment I was terrified. Juliet is shorter than I am, and I was eye to eye with whoever this was, and her eyes were too far apart to have been Juliet's. Hey, is everything all right? I asked, like an idiot.
Jeb,
She said.
I can give you anything you want.
I knew right away what she really was. I knew her malicious intentions. Jesus help me, I said under my breath in a fearful whisper, gun still in my hand, safely aimed toward the ground with my finger off the trigger. As soon as those words left my mouth, she visibly flinched, as if she had smelled something disgusting. I could only tell by her silhouette and the reflections in her eyes, though. I stood still, realizing what I had just said, while she backed away from me, back into darkness. Up until this point during my story, my buddies sat staring at me completely silent, listening to me speak. Dude, why didn't you just shoot her? You had a gun, right? Said the youngest guy. I told him it would have been useless to shoot the witch. It wouldn't have killed her or even hurt her, probably. How? Why? He replied. I began to explain to them what witches really are. People who practice witchcraft and offer rituals to demons they conjure in return for something they want. My theory was that this witch in particular achieved immortality through the sacrifice of people and animals. I could tell they were thinking it over and trying to decide whether to believe me or not. And to those listening, I know y'all might think this is unbelievable, and if I hadn't seen it all before, I wouldn't believe it either. The truth is, my parents were and still are very prominent figures in the church I grew up in. Being elders of the church community, they both performed exorcisms throughout my childhood. And no, I don't mean the stereotypical Hollywood Catholic priest with a little white thing on his neck under a black jacket holding up a wooden cross. They belonged to a Hispanic Protestant denomination that, in fact, thoroughly disagree with and oppose Catholicism. Being too young to stay home alone most of the time, I was often taken with my folks with them on house calls to pull demons out of people. It was a horrible experience every time. In Latin American cultures, it's not uncommon for people and their kids to visit witch doctors or healers when feeling sick, or when they want their lives to move in a better direction, and sometimes when they want harm to come upon someone who has wronged them. Participating in these rituals is like an open invitation for demons and leaves people vulnerable to demonic activity, so there was always someone in need of help in our community. I watched and listened to everything my parents did during exorcisms, and read every book my dad kept in his office about the subject. By the time I had this incident in the woods, I already knew what to do and what not to do very well. I resumed my story after explaining a bit more to my buddies. As I was saying, I stood in the dark forest with my lamp held up with my outstretched arm until I could no longer see or hear the witch backing away. My adrenaline took a while to fully dissipate. Then fear hit me hard. I tried walking back to my campsite steadily and quietly, but my nerves got the best of me, and I ended up almost sprinting through the dark. I was pretty confident I could find my way back, but either way, I checked my compass frequently. Yet, after running and running in the correct direction, I never reached my campsite. I felt confused and doubted myself like never before. Maybe I really don't know anything about being in the woods, I wondered. How could I have gotten myself so lost? I turned around and walked until I saw a familiar pattern in the trees. Once I felt confident about where I was, I forced myself to walk back to where I ran into the witch. When I found the tree she was initially hiding behind, I stared at it for a good while, expecting her to peek around it again, but nothing, thankfully. I retraced my steps back to where I detoured off my path to follow Juliet's voice, and after hiking a bit longer, I found my campsite. I was exhausted, covered in sweat, scratched up, hungry, and humiliated by the woods. I considered packing everything up and starting on the long walk back to the cabin, but I had no energy. I ate and called it a night. I didn't sleep much, even though I felt entirely drained. The woods were very loud that night, even by a summer night's standard. The bugs and animals didn't stop me to take a breath for a second, and the owls were particularly aggressive as well. I could hear them screaming near and far all night. Every time I began to drift off into rest, I would get awakened to the owls' screams echoing in the forest. Or at least, that's what I assumed to be owls. I turned to look at the guys and asked them if they were still down to creep into the woods. They looked at each other and hesitantly said yes, nervously chuckling. "Well, y'all go ahead. I'm not going in there right now," I said, laughing to myself. "But it didn't do anything to you. You scared her away," one of them replied. "Maybe, but only because I said Jesus," I said. "Well, then just say it again if she comes back." He was noticeably irritated. "It's not that simple," I replied. "I think you really have to believe for that to work. And I can say I really did believe back then, but now, I won't be calling on anyone to come help me." After I said that, I don't remember much about that night, other than all of us ending the night by watching Blood Diamond in the cabin. It's the only movie my folks have in there. I think it was already there when they bought the place. As for what I said about believing, I'm not 100% sure it's right. Most demons hate God and Jesus, and I'm not sure if they care if you believe in God or not. It's not that I don't believe in God anymore. However, the only reason I do believe is because I've seen the other side of things. That witch knew what I loved and what I missed, and that I would do anything for Juliet. I've seen and felt evil. but I've never felt God. The Magic Needle Treatment, called Susuk, from J. Ion. As a child, I often accompanied my father to his acupuncture sessions. Because my dad was receiving a specialized acupuncture treatment that required the use of gold-plated needles that were very expensive compared to the regular disposable needles, my dad had his used needles sanitized after every use and stored in a Tupperware container, then brought home to be kept until the next session. It was a regular sight for his container with the gold-plated needles to be placed on the kitchen counter, where my mom usually bakes. Even though I was a child, I knew not to mess with the needles, because it was dangerous, and I knew my father would get very angry if I lost his expensive tools for treatment. There was a time when my grandmother decided to stay for a month with my family. One of those days, she decided to go to the traditional Chinese medicine clinic, where my dad got his acupuncture treatment, to get a consultation and treatment for her weakening general health. As my grandmother and I waited for my father to get ready, I crawled onto the kitchen counter and took the container with the gold-plated needles in it, and I started shaking it like a tambourine out of boredom. My grandmother saw through the semi-transparent lid of the container and remarked at how fine those needles were. This is when she, being descended from a long line of powerful shamans in the superstitious, rural villages of Thailand, started telling me about Susuk, or colloquially known as the magical needle treatment. According to her, very fine and small needles will be placed deep into the facial muscles and skull of a person who seeks beauty, fame, and fortune from a witch doctor. The needles are not inserted physically, but magically, as in the witch doctor has to perform a ritual to make spirits, typically evil ones, bound by black magic, to materialize these tiny needles deep within the face of the person, without puncturing the skin at all. Apparently this Susuk, or magical needle treatment, was very popular among aspiring artists and tycoon wannabes who want the easy and fast way to stardom and success. Me and my child brain couldn't comprehend the idea of having needles anywhere on the head, or the concept of black magic. I remember asking her repeatedly, "Isn't it painful? Why do they do it? Can't they feel it?" She explained that women used it to make themselves irresistibly beautiful, and men would use it to make themselves rich and powerful. As a child, I couldn't wrap my head around the logic and logistics of doing such a procedure. I remember thinking that my grandmother was a nutter, because there was no way anyone could do something so awful to themselves and instantly become beautiful, wealthy, powerful, famous, or successful. It sounded a lot like those endings in fairy tales, where everyone lives happily ever after, immediately at the conclusion of the worst time of their lives. I didn't think much of the story that my grandmother told me until I stumbled across a movie based on this Susuk many years later. A relative of mine bought several DVDs of supernatural horror films to watch during the long holidays, one of them being a movie based on the practice. The movie was actually titled Susuk. This piqued my interest because the memory of what my grandmother told me resurfaced. However, she'd been dead for several years at that point, so I couldn't ask her without the utilization of a Ouija board or a psychic. So I turned to good old Google to find out more. Turns out Susuk wasn't as straightforward and clean-cut as the brief story my grandmother told me. Other than the hefty fee and expensive offerings to be given to the witch doctor, the procedure itself was an unstable one, where if the witch doctor was not well trained and incompetent, it could be botched so badly that the life of the person requesting the magical needle treatment will be taken by the very same spirits meant to endow that person with unnatural charm and riches. Even in the case of a successful Susuk application, the newly seductive or fortuitous person has to observe very strict rules to maintain the efficiency of the black magic. These rules include never putting anything pointy in the mouth, never crossing a body of water, do not prick or injure any part of the skin, avoid sacred places and sharp objects, including broken glass and ceramics, must not be out of home on certain days of the month, and never reveal the true names of people and places involved in the procedure. Those who request for plenty of enhancements, where they desire more than just beauty or wealth, must offer more to the witch doctor and the spirits maintaining the black magic, sometimes even blood sacrifices on a regular basis. Death for those with Susuk is extremely painful and slow, especially for those who have been fatally wounded or gravely ill, because the spirits bound by black magic will not let the soul leave the body until they have been appeased and freed by the witch doctor. So those who do not remove their Susuk on their deathbeds will be in very drawn-out agony, even literally skinned and disemboweled, yet still miraculously alive and enduring every moment in a lucid manner. I, for one, will never take part in any practice of black magic. From the stories my grandmother told me of her childhood filled with supernatural encounters, dark desires of humans, battles between good and evil, I know for a fact that some things in some places are not meant for mere mortals.